The Checkpoint is presented by GM Pharma, the first international multinational pharmaceutical company in Georgia. GM Pharma, to serve those who need it most.
Despite the strong recovery pace that Georgia's economy has shown in numbers, the IMF slashes its growth projections for 2022 for Georgia to 3.4%. The IMF says that the spillover effect of Russia's war in Ukraine on Georgia will be very essential. According to the newest report, another country in the region to suffer as strongly as Georgia is Armenia. The Checkpoints talked to Jihad Azour, head of the Department of MENA-CCA Region at the IMF, for more insights. We are starting our interview with Mr. Jihad Azour, who is joining us via Zoom. Mr. Azour, welcome, and thank you for your time, of course.
Thank you for having
Mr. Azour, I will break our tradition of interviews and ask you about Georgia first, because everyone is very interested here in Georgia. What is the perspective of the new IMF program for Georgia? Do you know anything about it?
Well, Eleni, thank you for having me. As you know, Georgia was enjoying strong recovery in 2021, and then the war in Ukraine came and affected the economic and financial situation in Georgia after a growth last year that exceeded 10%. This year, Georgia will see a downgrade in growth to 3.4%. As you know, Georgia and the fund have a very long collaborative relationship. Several programs of reforms were introduced by Georgia, supported by the fund. As you know, recently we have reached staff level agreement. The team from the fund working on Georgia with the authorities that has as an objective to accompany Georgia in the next round of reforms and transformation.
Yes, of course, I know that you cannot be talking much about the program before it is approved by the board, and we know that it will be by the end of May, and we're looking for that decision. But what do you know so far? What we have talked in our last interview, it was about a year ago. Do you think the reforms that you have mentioned as crucial, like SOE reform and also like prioritizing infrastructure projects and looking for more prudent fiscal policy would stay on the agenda that both the government of Georgia and IMF have looking forward?
Of course, those are important reforms, because implementing those reforms will help Georgia's economy to grow faster, to create more jobs, and to remain stable. And we saw during the war in Ukraine that this big shock that affected directly the economy of Georgia through several channels allowed, because thanks to the good policies, allowed Georgia to address those shocks and to preserve economic stability. And this is despite the fact that this crisis will have an impact on Georgia's economy. Therefore, prudent macroeconomic policies to keep inflation under control. This goes in line with what the Central Bank of Georgia is doing to keep also Georgia's economy shielded from the neighboring shocks, providing social protection, especially for the low-income people, while preserving the fiscal situation, are still key priorities. In addition to that, maintaining the stability in the financial system and modernizing the economy are important priorities for the recovery going forward, especially after addressing the direct impact of the war in Ukraine.
Since you mentioned this Russia's devastating war in Ukraine, what are some of the spillover effects in terms of economic development and economic growth and general figures? And we will talk about them more in detail during our interview. But what are more general spillover effects that you see in terms of Georgia and in terms of the whole region?
Well, of course, given the proximity geographically and in terms of economic relationship, both Georgia and the region are directly affected by the war in Ukraine. Sanctions are affecting the trade, both export and import. As you know, almost 1/3 of the export of Georgia, for example, is going to Russia, and the same also in terms of import. Therefore, those will be directly affected. Another channel is related to remittances that constitute around 4% of GDP for Georgia. Those remittances are an important lifeline to many families. Impact on the financial sector, that the central bank has already been taking certain number of measures to address that. Last but not the least, there are indirect channels too. The increase in prices worldwide, the increase in inflation, as well as also the volatility because of the uncertainty we see on the international financial markets are also challenges for Georgia, as well as also for several other countries in Caucasus and Central Asia.
Are these sanctions imposed on Russia because of its actions in the 21st century, which should have been a century of diplomacy rather than armed war? Are these sanctions working? And I mean specifically, are they affecting Russia more than affecting region, including Georgia?
I would say that the war in Ukraine and the instability is affecting first and foremost the region, as well as also the overall global economy, because it created uncertainties and led to increase in prices of commodities, wheat, fertilizers, but also price of energy. Those spikes in prices came in a context where inflation was already high globally, and this inflation was leading to a normalization of monetary policy with increase in interest rates. This came and exacerbated those trends and created, through this uncertainty, high level of, I would say, challenges to many countries, both in terms of the impact on their population, especially those, the most vulnerable ones, but also impact on policy management, and created the need to adjust policies. When it comes to Caucasus and Central Asia, the combined effect of the war and the sanctions led to reduced growth projections for this year for most of the countries. Growth projections were downgraded because of that. Of course, countries who have previously rebuilt buffers are able to address the shock in a better way. And Georgia is among those countries. Countries who have strong relationship with Russia will be more affected. There is the effect of the immediate shock that countries are currently dealing with, but also there could be some repercussions over the medium term. And this is where it becomes even more important than before to deploy the needed reforms in order to increase productivity in the economy, attract investment, address some of the issues like, for example, the SOE reform in Georgia, and increase the level of intra-regional trade to create an alternative source of economic activity and growth.
What about inflation and pass-through of external factors? Because earlier projections were that this could be a little bit more smoother process, and inflation could start coming down in most of the countries of the region by the end of this year. What has changed in these projections?
Well, of course, as you remember, last year, the strong recovery globally came with a high level of inflation that was perceived to be transitory, but clearly because of the bottlenecks we saw in supply and the sharp increase in demand, inflation is lasting longer than expected and has affected many countries in the world. It has affected them directly because of increase in prices, but also indirectly because of the normalization of monetary policies, both in Europe and in the US, leading to increase in interest rates. Therefore, we had this issue to start before the war in Ukraine. The war in Ukraine has exacerbated that, has created additional pressure points, especially for those who have direct impact from this war. Georgia is one of those countries, as well as also other countries in the region. Prices of wheat, prices of other commodities went up, prices of fertilizers too, in addition to the increasing prices of energy. This is an additional challenge that countries need to face. Controlling and reducing the level of inflation is priority number one. Addressing the impact of increasing price of goods and services on the low-income people by redirecting social support and by targeting and redirecting social support to protect the low-income people. Maintain a good level of coordination between fiscal, monetary, and exchange rate policy to reduce the impact of those external shocks are priorities that governments and central bank in the region need to contemplate and to accelerate. The good news is many countries in the region have already done the right measures, both in terms of adjusting their exchange rate and showing through flexibility how this could shield and protect the economy. Also using the monetary policy instruments in order to reduce the risk of hyperinflation or a risk of having this inflation becoming more entrenched.
Despite this, real GDP growth projections also face some downside risks, so to say, right? This means that budget revenues might suffer. How do you think keeping the track in policy, in economic policy making, which is backed by again some incentives, paying some incentives from the budget, does this seem sustainable? Because that's what we are seeing. Yet what Prime Minister, what the government is talking about.
Prudent fiscal policy is very important because also in time of high inflation, you don't want to increase the pressure on prices by increasing the level of public spending. However, it's very important to redirect spending and privilege social protection as well as also public investment. Social protection in order to alleviate the pressure of high inflation on the vulnerable groups. Investment spending in order to prepare the economy for a fast and inclusive recovery. Those are the priorities. On the other hand, keeping revenues or domestic revenues strong, reforming tax system when needed in order to increase the level of equity in the system. Those are important steps.
How do you see the privatization process in this situation? Because the government in Georgia is also keen on privatizing, and we see some Russian capital also flowing in Georgia for a number of slots. Do you think it's wise to privatize at this point?
We have all the evidence to show that the private sector is better when it comes to creating jobs and growing the economy. It's more productive, effective than the public sector. And the role of the state is more productive by being supportive to the private sector, creating the good business environment, and being an enabler. Whatever is done in order to go in this direction is a step in the right direction. In addition to that, there are still a certain number of state-owned entities that will not be or will gradually be privatized. Improving the efficiency of those will also help. Fiscal transfer to SOEs is high compared to the level of productivity and profitability they have, and not only in Georgia, in several countries in the region and beyond the region, are showing that bringing more market rules and market dynamic into the functioning of some of those services and activities is positive for the economy and positives in terms of job creation.
Stronger FX reserve today, but higher public debt, especially foreign currency denominated debt. This is one of the subtitles of the report that's assessing economic growth projections for the region. Is it a dilemma right now?
Well, of course, countries are different. You have countries who have sufficient level of buffers and have the right macroeconomic policies, and you have countries with less buffers and higher level of debt. For those who have higher level of debt and they have limited fiscal space, it's very important to maintain the pace of fiscal consolidation while making it more inclusive. How we make it more inclusive is by reducing current spending that are not productive and redirect all these resources to provide additional support to low-income people by widening the social spending. Therefore, I think here policies have to be, while respecting the broad principles, is to keep inflation under control, which is the biggest risk this year, shield the economy from shocks and uncertainties, which is also another issue that countries need to deal with, and maintain the capacity to have a transformative recovery, which is also very important to build up for a better future. Beyond that, each country has its own situation because each country is affected differently by the war in Ukraine and by the overall increase in prices and interest rates worldwide. It's always wise to keep debt under control and to gradually reducing it. It's also wise to have a macro economic management that favors the medium term through medium-term fiscal and economic framework. It's also wise to make sure that monetary policy is credible. Credibility of the monetary policy is also important for the stability of the economy and for attracting additional capital flows.
Looking at the region, Mr. Azour, where would you place Georgia in those categories that you just mentioned?
Well, in the region, you have three categories. You have the oil exporting ones who have, in addition to their economic situation, the buffers of the reserves. And the increase in oil price will favor those. You have the second group, which are the oil importing countries, but good macroeconomic fundamentals. Georgia is one of them. They need to keep the focus on having the right set of policies, the policies that promote economic stability, reduce the risks. The risk of inflation is the most important one these days. Shield the economy from the negative impact of the war in Ukraine and prepare for the future. This requires a right balance between addressing through policies and achieving macroeconomic stability, but also preparing the future. And this is where the reform program of Georgia now has several components. One of them is reforming state-owned entities with the objective that this will help create additional growth, will help promote the role of the private sector.
Does that also imply that monetary policy in Georgia should stay on its strict side, so to say?
The monetary policy in Georgia has proved its effectiveness. It has helped reduce the level of inflation, which is the main target of the monetary policy, and also protected Georgia from external shocks. In addition to that, the supervision of the financial system and the banking system led to the development of well-capitalized and competitive banks. Those are the right policies. Of course, the environment today is more challenging with a war in the neighborhood that has led to increase in prices, shortages in certain number of supplies, and affected because of the links of currencies, affected the currencies of the region, including the Georgian currency. Those are additional challenges that need to be addressed. Again, I think what is important is to make sure that policies are well set, but also well coordinated.
What does that mean in economic growth and economic policy making, decision making standpoint? What should be the priority? Economic growth or maintaining the stability?
Well, those objectives go in tandem. They go in hand to hand. When you have instability in the economy, usually it leads to high level of interest rates, a refrain from investors, especially foreign direct investors, from coming, and will destabilize also the economic activity. Therefore, economic stability and economic prosperity go hand in hand. What does it mean? It means now that the first priority is to shield the Georgian economy from the shock. Georgia is facing two big shocks: the shock of the war and the neighborhood, and the shock of the uncertainties in the global financial system. Second is to make sure that the economy that is recovering from the COVID crisis is addressing the scarring that in any economy were perceived after the COVID first shock. In the case of Georgia, I'm sure that the tourism sector and a certain number of other sectors were affected. Three is maintain a good level of social protection that allows those who are in fragility and in need to be supported, and also build very strong social system that creates new generation of well-educated Georgians, and also provide the right level of healthcare support. Last but not the least is to promote through predictable economic policies a good framework for the private sector to grow.
And my last question, and thank you for this interview. It is always very interesting talking to you, and time flies by. Thank you for your time once again. My last question: what is IMF's stance on international sanctions, and what is its message for the countries that it works with? Because this is a very diverse pool of countries. Should these international sanctions be respected? And do you see any threat for Georgia to become some kind of a hole for doing business and avoiding these international sanctions, as voiced by some of the ambassadors here in Georgia?
Well, we are extremely well informed and involved with all countries in the region. In the last week, we had several meetings with the delegations from Caucasus and Central Asia, including the Georgian delegation at the spring meeting. And yesterday, we had a discussion on the policy priorities with the managing director of the fund, with ministers and governors of the region, where it was a great opportunity for us to listen and see firsthand what are the challenges that those countries are dealing with. Our commitment to Caucasus and Central Asia is still as strong as it was during COVID, where Caucasus and Central Asian countries were among the first in the world to receive financial support from the fund. And also last year, with the distribution of the special drawing rights. Therefore, the priority for us is to provide both policy support and technical support to countries in the region to navigate this very difficult moment in economic history, but also to help them shield their economy from any risks, including sanction risks.
Thank you for taking our questions and for this very interesting interview.
The Checkpoint is presented by GM Pharma, the first international multinational pharmaceutical company in Georgia. GM Pharma, to serve those who need it most.